It's election time in Russia, and the Kremlin's young guard is taking to the streets. This is Nashi, a government-funded support group for President Vladimir Putin. Critics denounce it as a kind of Russian Hitler Youth movement. They see themselves as patriots defending Russia from Western-backed enemies. Masha Drokova is a Nashi commissar committed to fighting the president's foes.
Таких людей, как Касьянов, Каспаров и других предателей. Мы считаем этих людей предателями. И мы хотим, чтобы Россия была суверенной демократией. А это возможно только, на мой взгляд, только при следовании курса президента Путина.
For the past 3 years, the Kremlin has groomed these young Russians as a vanguard against political challenge. At this summer camp, they were even given military training. Nashi was formed to counter pro-Western youth groups that helped overthrow regimes in neighbouring Ukraine and Georgia. With more than 100,000 members, Nashi provides a handy rent-a-crowd to disrupt opposition protests. Putin himself has given them lessons on how the West wants to take over Russia.
Другим странам, к нам в том числе, они предъявляют какие-то повышенные претензии. В том числе дают оскорбительные, на мой взгляд, для нашей страны, для нашего народа советы поменять Конституцию. Мозги им надо поменять, а не Конституцию нашу. Мозги. И я скажу почему. Потому что то, что они предлагают, это очевидный рудимент колониального мышления.
The few politicians daring to oppose Putin, like former Soviet chess champion Gary Kasparov, were denounced as prostitutes.
Это наш коллега, элитная проститутка Гарри Каспаров, интердевочка, обслуживал президента США.
That's the website.
Like all liberal critics, Kasparov is disparaged as a Western stooge. But if Washington is funding him, he's not splashing the dollars on his Moscow headquarters.
And that's the best we can afford.
But your opponents say you're funded by the CIA.
Yeah, okay, but probably money, disappears somewhere, But we are even, in potential danger of losing this place as well, because the owner doesn't like us. That's one way.
Kasparov might be running a shoestring campaign, but he represents everything the Kremlin fears. A pro-Western liberal aiming to topple the regime.
That's for the loudspeaker for the street activities.
They recognize that we represent a real threat. Not because we can mobilize a lot of people. The normal turnout at our events is 3,000 to 4,000 people. But 3,000 to 4,000 people in Moscow or St. Petersburg, it's a great, it's quite an impressive number. In Moscow, you are most likely going to face an angry police and the regime that is using brutal force against the oppositions.
But Kasparov's genius as a chess player is proving no match for Kremlin rules. When he tried to campaign for the presidency, the state's pawns knocked him out of the game. Nashi attacked his every move, the government barred him from the airwaves, and in December police jailed him for 5 days for holding an unauthorised rally.
Tell your leaders that this regime is criminal, is a police state. They arrest people everywhere because they're scared stiff.
Over the last 8 years, Putin's regime built up, slowly but steadily, all sorts of obstacles. Legal, quasi-legal, some say constitutional, I believe most of them are anti-constitutional measures that are preventing an opposition candidate, a democratic candidate, to stand on the elections.
It's perhaps not surprising that the Kremlin would be obsessed with Western influence and opposition. In Soviet times, Putin was a KGB spy, and he's elevated many of his KGB colleagues to powerful positions. They've watched in horror as Western-backed parties swept to power in Ukraine and Georgia. Nearing the end of his final term, Putin is determined that won't happen in Russia.
У нас с вами есть шанс сформировать устойчивую власть Российской Федерации после мартовских выборов 2008 года. И не просто устойчивую власть, а власть, которая будет проводить тот курс, который приносил положительные результаты на протяжении последних 8 лет.
Putin has named a loyal protege to succeed him. Dmitry Medvedev is just 42 and has no independent power base. Putin will be his prime minister and perhaps continue to be the real power in Russia. But it's too simplistic to see this as just a battle between good, brave Democrats and a nasty dictator. Russian politics is far more complex and murky. You see, there's a genuine belief here that the West wants to keep Russia weak, and that one of its tools for doing that is demanding Western-style democracy. The reforms the West imposed here in the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed came close to destroying Russia. Boris Yeltsin presided over a chaotic regime with a gridlocked parliament and a hostile media controlled by corrupt tycoons. Businessmen posing as liberals stole billions from the sell-off of public assets. Ordinary Russians lost everything. Many see Putin as the saviour of Russia. Sergei Markov is a long-time friend of both Putin and Medvedev. He's patriotic and devout, braving freezing temperatures to mark the Orthodox celebration of the baptism of Christ.
Putin moved country from chaos and anarchy to the normal life. That's why most of the people think that Putin make more for democracy than create problem for democracy.
In December, Markov was elected to parliament as a member of the pro-Kremlin party United Russia. The election marked the end of any real opposition in the Duma, save for a tame communist rump. Impossibly high party quotas and Kremlin-controlled media ensured not a single liberal was elected.
The liberal opposition only exists in the Western media. I am very much surprised that even 1% of the population has supported certain of the extreme liberal protests. In fact, they totally failed.
The Orthodox Church has welcomed the liberals' demise. It always saw their model of Western-style democracy as alien to Russian tradition, preferring the Tsarist model of Kremlin dictate under its spiritual guidance. Father Vsevolod is the spokesman for the Moscow Patriarch.
If a society is divided along the commercial interests or political convictions, it's illness, it's not a creative conflict. And we always opt for unity of the society.
Moscow today seems a world away from the turmoil of the Yeltsin era. Thanks largely to the oil boom, the capital is awash with money, development and opportunity. At 18, Masha Drokova from Nashi is too young to remember communism, but she does remember the 90s when her parents struggled to raise her.
Я думаю, что люди на самом деле живут лучше, чем 8 лет назад, когда они получали по 1,5 года зарплат, бюджетники зарплаты, когда велась война в Чечне, когда наша страна, она была в унизительном положении.
But how much has really changed? Most development is still geared to the super rich. Putin has jailed or exiled tycoons who challenged him politically. Others have been allowed to keep their ill-gotten gains. Corruption is still endemic. The oil wealth has barely trickled down to ordinary Russians.
It's a very big gap between rich and poor people. It's one of our problems, and we are looking how we can solve this problem. Putin improved situation dramatically. That's why he is so popular. But he is not the god. He couldn't solve all problems.
And Moscow is not Russia. To see how the provinces are faring, we drove 2 hours from the capital to the wasteland of rural Russia. The village of Holtabina is typical of thousands of settlements across the world's largest country. It's dying, with young people leaving for the cities and old people struggling to survive. Vladimir Lastovkin has lived here since he was discharged from the army in 1971 and has little reason to be thankful to any politician.
Ну, трудно, конечно, трудно жить, да. Особенно в сельском хозяйстве. Помощи у нас неоткуда. Все вот только надеемся все сами на себя.
За кого вы голосуете?
Голосовали за Путина, мы голосовали, все за Путина.
За Путин?
Да.
Но он
нет,
он не будет президент.
Ну, понятно, нет, вот это самое, в смысле. А так за Медведева.
Почему?
Ну, вроде бы наставник Путина. Ну и, как говорится, лучшего-то вроде бы и не видно. Так вот посмотришь по телевизору.
It's the same across most of Russia. People's only knowledge of politics comes from state-controlled TV. They're not necessarily happy with Putin, but things aren't as bad as they were, and they can't see any alternatives. When I used to come to places like this in the 90s, there was a sense of utter desperation. People weren't getting their wages, they were waiting months for their pensions, everyone was living hand to mouth. Now, life is still grindingly hard, but there's at least a sense of stability, that the days of rapid and turbulent change are behind them, and that they can live with the devil they know. That makes it impossible for opposition figures to make a mark. Mikhail Kasyanov is the latest to take up where Gary Kasparov left off, launching a campaign as a liberal presidential candidate. But the only place he can be heard is a small Moscow radio station, Echo Moskvy, one of the last broadcasters that hasn't been taken over by the Kremlin.
Мы имеем нелегитимный парламент, и если мы будем иметь еще нелегитимного президента, вы понимаете, в какой стране мы окажемся? Это уже должно...
Kasyanov was Putin's prime minister for 4 years before falling foul of the KGB factions. But even he can't get onto Russian TV.
We don't have any access to any national-wide channel. Kremlin controls all national-wide television, and there is a very strong procedure, and there is simply just list of names prohibited even to mention, not to allow people to talk or to send their messages, but just to even to mention their names.
To qualify as an independent candidate, Kasparov had to collect 2 million signatures. He assured me he had met this seemingly impossible requirement.
Конечно, все документы, которые требуются, все подготовлены самым тщательным образом, самым лучшим образом. Все будет сдано, как положено по закону, и скоро начнем дебаты с властью.
So there'll be a real election?
Посмотрим, мы требуем.
But a few days later, the Electoral Commission knocked him out of the race, claiming thousands of his signatures were forged. The Kremlin tolerates 2 opposition parties, the Communists and the so-called Liberal Democrats, but neither pose any challenge. The Liberal Democrat leader, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, is famous for frequenting strip clubs and threatening to invade Alaska. As I found when I met him in his office, he remains an icon of political incorrectness.
Это подарок из Африки. Эбонит, особый дуб африканский, леопард натуральный. Подарили, я не просил.
Это настоящий?
Настоящий, из Африки. Там сделали, очень тяжелый, натуральное африканское дерево, дуб. Все это вот натуральный.
Это законный?
Что, подарок? Я не знаю, принесли сюда подарок мне, и все. Мы вот и браконьеры сделали, там, или контрабанда, я не знаю. Подарок, дню рождения, и все.
He also claims to be politically independent.
Мы никогда не поддерживали ни Горбачева, ни Ельцина, ни Путина и не будем поддерживать Медведева. На совещании в Кремле.
But his voting record looks remarkably like a Kremlin lackey's.
Zhirinovsky is a very smart, very savvy politician who made a lot of money by selling his political services to the regime. But in every crucial event, he sided with the regime, whether it was Yeltsin or Putin.
And so there'll be an election of sorts in March, an appearance of competition, a semblance of democracy, and a certain winner. State television portrays Dmitry Medvedev as a kind of Putin light. His emphasis is more on helping the poor than fighting the West.
Главное для развития нашей страны – это продолжение спокойного и стабильного развития.
Friends describe him as, well, rather like Putin.
He's same generation as Putin, as me, by the way, and our favorite cultural preferences is Beatles, Pink Floyd, Deep Purple, and so on. He's very sporty.
The most noticeable difference is that he was never in the KGB.
After Putin became the president, the big generations of former KGB officers come to the power. After Medvedev will be the president, big generation of technocrats and lawyers will come to the official positions.
So Russia could become more liberal?
Russia will become more liberal not because Medvedev, but because we have a result of Putin's stabilization, and now can move from the stabilization to the more liberal development.
On March 2nd, 130 million Russians will be urged to do their duty and vote. But in this very Russian-style democracy, the only vote that really counts has already been cast.